In this video, we're going to cover just kind of the basics of the beginning. Hitler and the Nazis declare war on Poland and invade Poland in 1939. They're going to control almost the entire continent. And it's a very, very grim time in European history. So let's get right into it. So we call this first initial dash of the Nazi army the Blitzkrieg, lightning war, because it really was so fast. Hitler invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, and he conquered it in just 4 weeks. And you have to remember on the map that Poland is one of the largest countries in Eastern Europe. So this is a pretty impressive feat. Even though Poland wasn't a terribly strong country itself, it's still a very, very fast and very aggressive approach. Of course, when you invade Poland and you get closer to the Soviet Union, this is threatening to the Soviet Union. So Hitler made a pact between Germany and the Soviet Union, the Non-Aggression Pact, in which they agreed to divide up Poland amongst the two powers. That pact won't stay very long, but it is very critical to Hitler's battle plans so that he doesn't have to worry about the Soviet Union as he goes on to the next part, which is France. So while this is all happening, France and Great Britain began rearming. They had already been in this process, as we talked about in class. Like, France had been keeping a nervous eye on the Nazis throughout the end of the 30s, in the mid-30s. And the French had set up along the Maginot Line, which is a series of fortifications along the traditional invasion route for Germany. Very similar in situation to the Western Front in World War I. And they're sitting there and they're waiting, and there's no invasion coming. In fact, the nickname for this operation was Blitzkrieg, because they were just sitting there. And instead of directly invading France, what Hitler does is he invades Denmark and he invades Norway. He actually goes north. And he's doing this because he wants to set himself up into a position to eventually invade Great Britain. Now, you have to remember, Great Britain has avoided invasion through all of the wars we've talked about in this course. So to invade Great Britain would be a monumental feat historically, and it is on Hitler's map. So eventually he does invade France. He invades Belgium, just like we saw in World War I when the Germans run through Belgium. And he breaks through the Maginot Line. And a big part of this, too, is that he sends his tanks through the Ardennes forest, which the French did not believe was possible. They thought it was too dense of a forest. And he's able to get through there. It gets the French scrambling. And he's pushing French and British soldiers very quickly to Dunkirk. And Dunkirk is a seaside town on the English Channel. And before we know it, there's an evacuation of 300,000 French soldiers at Dunkirk by the British. And they literally took every type of boat that they could find, and they were putting all of these soldiers in these boats. Some of them were just small fishing boats, and evacuating them across the Channel into Great Britain. Not a good situation at all for the French army. While that's going on, Mussolini also invaded France from the south. And before we know it, in just about a month or so, Paris is under the control of the Nazis, and the south of France is under the control of Mussolini's forces. And what happens here is that France does not become under the direct rule, if you will, of the Nazi regime or the Axis powers. Instead, a new Vichy government is set up with old Georges Pétain as the puppet leader. He was a French military commander, a French political leader as well in the World War I era. And he becomes the puppet leader, but by all intents and purposes, he is answering to Berlin whenever he's making decisions. Charles de Gaulle, however, who was the real French prime minister, and what was left of his army are now exiled in Great Britain, trying to come up with a way to eventually take back their own country. And the Battle of Dunkirk is just a fascinating, fascinating situation. All the photographs are like this one, where you just see masses of men hopping onto these boats and hopping onto these ships and evacuating to Great Britain. It's a really, really scary time for the French forces. And this, to me, is a very haunting photograph, this picture of Hitler right outside in front of the Eiffel Tower. And it just shows you how quickly they're able to take Paris and take over France. And France is supposed to be, you know, the strong power, the counterweight to the Germans on the continent. And then just like that, he's taken it over. It's under his control. And this is all happening in 1940. So I want you to take a look at this map in more detail in the textbook. And I really want you to take some time to look at the borders of the various battle fronts. because they shift over time, as you can see here. And I won't go into this in too much detail in this video, but you know, this is very misleading, the way that the publisher colored France, because yes, you know, technically it was its own country. Vichy is right here in this area in central France, and the Vichy government was a stronghold in the south of France, but really all of France was under the control of the Nazis until, as you see right here, the famous Battle of Normandy, the invasion of Normandy in June 6th, 1944. So for quite some time, France is under direct control of the Nazis, or under the Vichy puppet government. If we go over to the Eastern Front, you're going to see that, wait a minute, I thought they had a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. They did, but as we'll talk about in a minute, Hitler was using that as a stall and will violate that. And it's even scary too, because Hitler's forces get all the way to Moscow in October of 1941, and the Battle of Moscow and the Battle of Stalingrad, a very critical battle, a turning point in World War II. But look how far east this line goes. So you could essentially say at one point in 1941, Nazis controlled all the way to Moscow and Stalingrad, and all the way to Spain. And remember, Spain is under Francisco Franco's fascist regime. So Spain is a well, I wouldn't call them an ally, but they're not an enemy for sure of the Axis powers. And then you'll see here as well, with the exception of some holdouts, he gets all the way to Turkey. So for all intents and purposes, by 1941, 1942, just about the entire continent of Europe is under either German or Italian control. Very, very frightening. And of course, your holdout here is Great Britain. So let's talk about Great Britain and their holdout. Hitler offered peace to Great Britain in exchange for unchecked control of the continent, but the new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, refused this. He becomes the voice of resistance against Hitler in World War II in Europe. So when he refuses this, Hitler goes through with his battle plans for Great Britain of an invasion. The idea was that he would bomb the heck out of Great Britain, and he would bomb London as much as he could until he breaks the will and he breaks the forces of the British Army and the Royal Air Force, and then he would conduct a land invasion. So we call this the Battle of Britain. It was a bombing campaign over 11 months by the German Luftwaffe, which was their air force, against the cities of Great Britain. And that is an interesting point about this war, is that we are targeting civilian populations in a way we never did, maybe since the 30 Years' War. Kind of crazy. However, the Royal Air Force was able to outgun the Luftwaffe 3-1 in these battles. There were these epic dogfights at night and even during the day in the air. And the British are able to deal with this sustained bombing of their cities every night. You send your kids out to the countryside, to the cottage to live with your grandparents. Every night people go down into the underground, the subway tunnels, and camp out there. And then in the morning they would come back up. They would try to put things back together. They'd put out the fires, and they'd go about their business as best as they could. It's an amazing, amazing resolve that we see from the British people during this time. And in class we'll take a look at some stuff by Winston Churchill, some of the best speeches you will read in this course. And then about 6 months later, Hitler gives up this campaign and decides to focus instead on the Soviet Union. And here is a picture of German planes crossing the English Channel for their nightly bombing raid. And here are the brave British people, Londoners, down in the tunnels, camping out and avoiding the bombing that was going on overhead. And this is the picture of just a completely bombed out neighborhood in London, and the police forces putting out a fire the next day. Absolutely devastating. Absolutely devastating. So, like I said, Germany does eventually turn on the Soviet Union. This is Operation Barbarossa, which was Hitler's plan to invade Russia. He had already controlled the Balkans, the Balkan Peninsula, and Greece by 1941. But by doing so, and by going into the Balkans and Greece first, this caused a delay to the Soviet invasion, and a lot of historians argue that that is really the main reason that the Soviets are able to defend at the gates of Moscow and at Stalingrad. So a quick advance by the Nazis puts Hitler outside of Moscow by late 1941, but eerily enough, just like we saw with the invasion attempt of Napoleon way back, Hitler is bogged down by the Russian winter, and some trenches set up outside of Moscow, and it really becomes a stalemate. And the Battle of Stalingrad is a turning point for the Russians. You'll read more about this in the book. But this is where they kind of turn it around and are then able to go on the offensive against the Nazis. And you'll read about the details of that horrible, horrible battle in the book. But this is all part of Hitler's plan for what we call a new order, new world order. Hitler planned for a new order in Europe where Germans were to populate Eastern Europe, with Scandinavians assimilated into the society through re-education and purges of those who don't follow along. And there would be colonization of some ethnicities, elimination of others, and that sets us up for our Holocaust lesson in class tomorrow. And as Hitler began to face defeats, he kind of changes his thinking when he realizes he won't be able to set up this new racial order in Europe and this empire in Europe. He changes his priorities, and he gets to this really dangerous point where he thinks, well, if I'm going down, I would like my legacy to be eliminating all of the Jews from the continent before the end of the Third Reich. And that terrifying, terrifying viewpoint is what leads us to the Holocaust, which we'll talk about tomorrow in class.